I feel it is incumbent upon me, or anyone, or someone, to note that this is the yahrzeit, or the anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy 52 years ago today. And I'm saying that also because Kennedy was the first US president to speak of shared values between Israel and the United States, and was the first president to use the term special relationship to describe the relations between Israel and the United States. And I think people who look at the relations between Obama and Netanyahu say that it's special enough already, so maybe if it would be less special. I think that our panel is going to discuss the topic that is probably uppermost on the minds of many American Jews these days. It was a topic that was uppermost on the minds of the people who attended the recent General Assembly of the Jewish Federations in Washington. It's been a long, hot, and difficult summer for American Jews. There were harsh words and hard feelings in the boardrooms of federations throughout the country. People were not happy with each other. Some American Jews were accusing other American Jews of having stabbed Israel in the back. And others, although they weren't using those terms, were insinuating that others were warmongers. And there's also this argument among American Jews also exposed the gap between Israelis and American Jews, because Israelis, after all, overwhelmingly opposed the Iran deal, and Americans, the polls were all over the place, but at best, let's say that it was 50-50. This is against the backdrop of what has been seen as a growing distance between Israel and American Jews, for some because of the occupation, for others because of issues of pluralism having to do with the standing of Reform and Orthodox Jews. And it's also a topic that people are speaking of more and more than ever before. I'll quote Jeffrey Goldberg. He said that in a recent interview, he said that ultimately he predicts that if things remain the same, we're going to see a civil war, and the civil war will be between the Jews of Israel and the Jews of the United States. So we're going to discuss that, and I'll introduce our panelists. I'll start with Bret Stephens. He's the foreign affairs columnist and deputy editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal. He's a winner of a Pulitzer Prize. He wrote the 2014 book, America in Retreat, The New Isolation and the Coming Global Disorder. And if Wikipedia is to be believed in this case, you had a birthday yesterday, so happy birthday. Gidi Grinstein is the president and founder of the Reut Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit strategy group that aims to sustain significant contributions on Israel and the world, and the Jewish world under the banner of 21st century Zionism. He's the author of a book called Flexigidity, The Secret of Jewish Adaptability and Challenge and Opportunity Facing Israel. He was also a member of the Israeli negotiating team at the Camp David talks under Ehud Barak, and I only found out this week, actually, that he is someone who used the Heimlich maneuver in order to dislodge a peanut that had been lodged in Ehud Barak's throat, and possibly saving his life that way, and there's some people who haven't forgiven him for that. Gidi Grinstein. Ruth Calderon has a doctorate in Talmud. She established the first Israeli secular, pluralistic, and egalitarian Beit Midrash for women and men, and later Alma, another institute which is dedicated to opening Israeli eyes to their Hebrew heritage. She was a television host. She was an MK for Yesh Atid, and she had a maiden speech in the Knesset which spoke of the role of Jewish heritage and Jewish learning in her life, which turned her into an instant YouTube star, and probably the biggest YouTube star of 2013, Ruth Calderon. Finally, my friend and colleague at Haaretz, Peter Beinart. He's associate professor of journalism and political science at City University of New York. He's a senior columnist at Haaretz and a contributor to The Atlantic and the National Journal. He is the author of 3 books. The latest is the most notorious, perhaps we can call it, The Crisis of Zionism, Peter Beinart. So I'm going to start with Bret. And let's start with the jugular, head straight for the jugular. Bret, you've described the agreement that Obama concluded with Iran as in very harsh terms, including used the word garbage to describe it.
Did I?
Yes. And I'm not saying that, I'm just noting that. So there is a situation where half of American, let's say half of American Jews, either it's a bit more or a bit less, actually supported this agreement, contrary to the very adamant position taken by Prime Minister Netanyahu.
And the overwhelming majority of Israelis.
And the overwhelming majority of Israelis. Some American Jews, some prominent American Jews, also signed petitions against the agreement, but some signed petitions for the agreement that were published in the New York Times and other newspapers. So I wanted to see what you think of such. Is that a legitimate position for American Jews to take? Are they stabbing Israel in the back? Should they automatically support, or even not automatically support, the position of the Prime Minister of Israel under any circumstances, and especially such circumstances?
Well, of course it's a perfectly legitimate position to take. I think it's mistaken, and I think time will show that it's mistaken. And I don't think American Jews are obliged in any way to automatically support what the Prime Minister of Israel does. A lot of those of us on my side didn't support Yitzhak Rabin in 1993 or Ehud Barak in 1999, 2000. So there's no issue of legitimacy. This is a free country. People can reach their own conclusions. I would offer you a thought experiment, and imagine that instead of this deal being arrived at by President Obama, a Democrat, it had been reached by the reincarnation of George H.W. Bush, a realist, Republican, the sort of classic realist mold of foreign policy. A lot of his advisors, people like Brent Scowcroft, came out in support of the deal. I would wager, or I would suspect, that most of the people in this room who support the deal, if the parties had been turned, would be suspicious of it, would in fact oppose it. I cast my first ballot for Bill Clinton in 1992 because I thought George H.W. was so lousy on the subject of Israel. So I think that party affiliation probably drives a great deal of it. That being said, in countless conversations with a lot of thoughtful Jews around the country who supported the deal, I have yet to meet one who said this is a great deal. This is a really smart deal. This is the diplomatic equivalent of Nixon going to China. I've heard a lot of people say it's a lousy deal, it's dreadful, we should have gotten a better one, but it's the deal we have, and it's better than the alternatives that they can imagine. I also suspect that in 2 or 3 years, those of us who, maybe 4 or 5 years, those of us who oppose the deal will, and I say this with genuine regret, will be vindicated, just as those who opposed the Iraq War in 2003, people like Bernie Sanders and Barack Obama, found themselves vindicated just a few years later.
Thank you. Gidi.
Bibi.
Gidi.
Gidi.
Me.
Yeah,
oh, not Bibi.
First of all, I wanted to ask you, as an Israeli, whether you think that Israelis appreciate Bret's stance that American Jews are quite legitimate in taking any position they see proper, even if the Prime Minister is adamantly opposed, and in fact, specifically, whether they think that this is a legitimate position, given that we're talking here about Israel's security and that Israel is supposed to understand better than American Jews what its security needs are.
Well, I think that if you think about the history of Zionism, Zionism came to serve the Jewish people, and it saw itself as the national movement of the Jewish people. The State of Israel was designed to be the nation state of the Jewish people. Zionism emerged in an era of dramatic crisis for Judaism and for Jews, primarily in Europe. It emerged from the edges and the fringe of the Jewish world into the center. And from that perspective, it took, I believe, from that vantage point, it took a perspective of moral superiority over diaspora Jews, and in many respects, expected unconditional political and financial support. So for a long time, that was the case, but I think that 1982, the Second Lebanon War, by the way, was the threshold. That was the beginning of the change. By the way, I think only because diaspora Jews had no clue about what was going on around the 1973 war, when the Israeli government willingly went to war and rejected the peace offer of Sadat of 1972. So 1982 is the turning point, and since then we've been sort of growing away, but a lot of the expectation from diaspora Jews for this unconditional political and financial support is still there. And this is where I think that many Israeli leaders should have a much more nuanced approach. First of all, understanding that diaspora Jews are American Jews, most of them are first and foremost Americans. So they're not American Jews, they're actually Jewish Americans in terms of their identity. So what's the adjective and what's the noun is really important here. So most Jews in America are first of all Americans, they're Jewish Americans. The second, and therefore, like Americans, they are American citizens, fully participant in the American democratic process, voicing opinions as Americans. When it comes to Israel, Israel obviously has, for many of them, a very special connection. But this is where I think the government of Israel, in this case, stepped over the line when it expected institutions that are primarily community institutions to take a strong position on the deal. Because if you think about federations, in my view, federations are first and foremost peoplehood organizations. They need to represent the unity of the community. They need to bring about a very broad range of views. And when an organization like Federation is expected to take a position on an issue that is very controversial politically, that tears the organization from the inside. And I think that this is where the expectation of the Israeli government went a step too far. It's not just in federations, we see it in Hillels and in other institutions whose logic is the unity of the community and the service of the entire community. And these organizations are then expected to take a strong position on a politically controversial issue. And that's problematic because there's always the day after. And in the day after, there are schools to run. There is amazing JCCs like this one that need to be operated. And we need to think about that in the way we as Israelis expect Americans, Jewish Americans, to take a position on Israel-related issues.
Well, if you could relate to that, but also I'd like to inject something that about the difference or the gaps between Israelis and American Jews, and to inject the issue of pluralism. And I saw a quote of yours which said that, in a way, Americans are like Protestants in the sense that they recognize denominations and they live in a world of denominations, whereas Israelis are like Catholics. There's one true church, even if you don't belong to it. There's only
church
one.
I don't go to is
the synagogue I don't go to.
It's a catch-22.
So, and what I was struck by, that is not, I don't know how you meant it, but it didn't strike me as a very optimistic description, because at least maybe now they get along somehow, but for many years, you know, Catholics and Protestants were not the best of friends, to put it mildly. So do you think that this is an unbridgeable gap, or is there some movement?
I'm an optimist. And I think we are in a good place, in a new good place, as Gidi started to describe. And I'm a great believer of dispute. We are a nation that invented dispute as a way of philosophy. The Mishnah is the first time in culture, after the Roman dialogue or the Greek dialogue, to understand that to find someone that is not like you and does not think like you is a good thing. And that's the only way to go forward. So I feel that the dialogue between Jewish Americans, Israelis, and Israeli Americans, it's a three-way dialogue, is very fruitful. And in this place or side of America, the California, and especially here around the high-tech community, there's some kind of friction. A friction between the two cultures, Israelis that are Israeli Americans that are very Israeli and are here to stay, and American Jews or Jewish Americans that have the tradition of how to be a Jew in America. And in the beginning, they tried to bring the Israelis into the synagogues or bring the Jews into our culture. That doesn't work. And now there's a kind of friction, which I believe this morning, which is amazing in my eyes. I've never seen such a thing. The fact that a paper like Haaretz is here in such a, and this is a conversation that is a very Israeli conversation, and at the same time a very American conversation. These are new things that only happen. I think culture is always built in meeting places between two strong cultures. And Maimonides wouldn't be Maimonides if he was not in Egypt and reading Aristotle and trying to figure out how to be a Jew in that kind of framework. So I feel we are now in the company of the people who are intrigued by those questions of loyalty and trust and love. And for me, to be loyal is to question and is to have serious dispute. I just want to say that I belong to a center party in the Knesset. I'm now a free citizen, Chufshat Shichrur. Like I'm quite happy to be a citizen again after giving service. But I do not feel that Iran is the biggest threat. I did not identify with that, and therefore I did not feel that any American Jew is obligated to agree with the Prime Minister. I think that serious dispute is a way of showing love, is a way of showing care. If we are here on a panel of siblings, that's what Jewish siblings do. But in a way that there is a trust that nobody is going to completely leave the other. And we are going to dispute and stay in. I think what I see here is one of the richest moments in American Jewish and Jewish American and Israeli American cultural life.
Okay. Peter.
I just want to add one sentence. I'm sorry, Peter. The fact that the Prime Minister of Israel announced some weeks ago that pluralistic Judaism is important, that's a big achievement, I think, of Jewish Americans that he needs to answer to, and that I feel, I just want to say, I'm sorry, I don't want to give the whole speech, but I want to say that for me, Israel is a project that American Jews have a share in, and they have an obligation to speak out and להשפיע and influence this joint project. And I want to say that I think, Bibi, that Prime Minister Netanyahu was affected by that. He's not my friend, he's a Prime Minister. No, I mean, I want to speak with honor.
As a cynical reporter, I checked up, and it's the 7th time that he's said that now is the time to embrace pluralistic.
7 is a good number in
Okay, Peter, there's been far too much agreement here in the panel.
It's disturbing.
I'm hoping that you will. The things that have been said by Bret, Gidi, and Ruth, do they reflect the way the American Jewish world is being run? I mean, are the establishments, is AIPAC, the Conference of Presidents, are they open to different points of view? Are they, I mean, we all know that, for example, J Street has not been accepted into the Conference of Presidents, and there was a vote, and it was rejected. So does this atmosphere of live and let live, and we live for the dispute as long, is that really, is that a reflection of the way, where American Jewish life is right now?
I think that the biggest failure of the American Jewish establishment vis-a-vis Israel has been the failure to give younger American Jews a decent Jewish education. Because the foundation for a connection to Israel is a connection to Judaism. If you have a connection to Judaism, I have to say one of my proudest moments as a parent, and believe me, I'm in many ways not a very good parent, but when I was in Israel with my son, and he was 5, and we were in Jaffa, he said, "Oh, isn't this where Jonah left from?" Oh. Right? So he had learned something that made him understood why this was a very exciting place. It was not the same as Italy, even though the food might be better in Italy, right? It was a place that he had a connection to.
That's not true.
So, all right, maybe the food is not better than in Italy. But, so, in a way, I have many critiques of the way the American Jewish establishment deals with Israel. But in a way, my most fundamental critique is they have tried to put Israel at the center of American Jewish identity, Israel often and the Holocaust, at the expense of actually trying to figure out ways.
Not the right time. For such noise.
Is that your heart beating?
הלב שלנו חלש.
What they haven't done is put enough focus on how to make younger American Jews fascinated with Judaism. That's not the same as being observant according to any particular halakhic definition. It's to say, how do you raise a generation that finds joy in, love of, and fascination with this tradition and the belief that it can help to answer some of the questions that you struggle with in your life, and that you grow up having these memories of joy, right? The average American Jewish kid gets schlepped to Yom Kippur once a year, maybe to Rosh Hashanah as well, which they remember as the most boring day of the year for them.
And
right?
Sunday school.
And Sunday school, right? The Sunday school, which are generally very, very, very ineffective. And the Jewish day schools, basically you have to mortgage your house to afford them, and they don't have a science lab, right? So this is beyond the politics. What I notice about younger American Jewish kids is if they, in their formative years, develop some sense of joy in and fascination with Judaism, they are in the game in the Israel conversation. They could be far right, could be far left, they may not even be Zionists, but they care, they're in the game. You don't have to convince them why they should care. You can argue the politics with them. My biggest problem when I go to speak to liberal American Jews, and you're right, they're better described as liberal Jewish Americans on campus, is not to convince them that they should dislike some of the things that Benjamin Netanyahu does. It's to convince them that they should care at all. Because they say, as liberal universalists, wait a second, you want me to care more than climate change? You want me to care more than what's happening in Syria or what's happening in Congo? I'm a universalist. And because they don't feel enough of a special connection to being a member of the Jewish people and connection to the Jewish tradition, they just opt out. So, the truth is, people sometimes ask me, why are you such a masochist? Why do you send your kids to Jewish school? Why do you go to an Orthodox school? Why do you constantly surround yourself with people who hate your views on Israel? First of all, I say that many of them are relatives, so I have no choice. But secondly, because the truth of the matter is that I am more comfortable and happier being with people who virulently disagree with me, but who are in the game for us as a people in this argument than I am with people who are liberals, but basically see it as just another one of 17 different issues that they could take or leave. And that's actually our deepest failure.
That was an excellent response to a question that I didn't ask. So if you can give a short response to the question that I did ask about the Jewish establishment and its attitude towards dissent.
But in his point about disagreement, he agreed with Ruth. So.
That's true. Look, the problem is that even if you look at those younger American Jews who do care, look at the people in the independent Minyan movement, for instance, which is one of the most important, I think, organic movements of younger American Jews that have emerged. Or you look at the younger Reform or Conservative or Reconstructionist rabbis. So these are people who are success stories. They actually do care. They also generally have a different perspective on Israel than their parents. They are more critical. Why are they more critical? First of all, they are simply more assimilated into American society. So the idea that they would say some things only to Jews but not to everybody else doesn't fit their lived reality because they've grown up doing everything with non-Jews. So that distinction is not meaningful to them. Secondly, they have not grown up with an experience of the Holocaust or an experience of 67 or 73 of having had a moment in their lives when they remember feeling like Israel could go out of business, that Israel was going to be destroyed. They've grown up with Israel as a superpower, a regional superpower. So they see Israel as powerful, and they're also more likely to be interested in questions of Jewish power rather than simply Jewish survival. And they are asking very, very difficult questions, and oftentimes the responses they get are, you can question the existence of God, You can question whether the Torah was given from Sinai, but you cannot question the convention of wisdom about Israel. And so what sometimes you find is the most interesting and most articulate and most iconoclastic of them become very, very, very alienated by that. They've grown up thinking that what they like about being Jewish is that Jews argue all the time. And then it turns out that on the thing that people care about the most, you're not allowed to argue. Or at least the argument takes place within very, very narrow confines, the confines that come out of a previous generation's experience. You know, they said, right, we're supposed to believe that every generation hears the voice of Sinai anew. This generation has a very, very different experience. One last point, the reason they do. They have never seen any large-scale aliyah to Israel of Jews fleeing government-sponsored anti-Semitic persecution. That's extremely important. Even people of my age, we remember the Russian and Ethiopian exoduses. So even if we can't stand everything Israel does, the reason you need an Israel is self-evident, because Jews need a place to go. This generation, now maybe France will change that, but this generation has grown up with most Jews in the diaspora living in liberal democracies. So for them, the question of why you need a Jewish state to begin with is not as self-evident. It doesn't mean they're anti-Zionist, but they want to ask the question. But if they ask the question at all, then they're often ruled out of the conversation. And that, I think, is terribly, terribly self-defeating, not only for them as people who relate to Israel, but for them as people who want a Jewish experience.
Bret, I'd like to ask you a question about politics. You wrote that the Democratic Party is distancing itself from Israel gradually and surely. Nonetheless, most American Jews have voted for Democrats in the past 20, 30 years, and I'm assuming that they will, among other things, because there is their outlook on everything else besides Israel, even if they are not happy with the Democratic outlook on Israel, is more in conformity with the liberal values of the Democratic Party, and the converse is true about the Republican Party. Is that not something that will continue forever? Do you see any way that is going to change? There's this lament among people who, Norman put Haaretz's famous lament, why are Jews so liberal? How do they continue to be so liberal?
Well, let me just preface my answer by saying that I thought the first part of Peter's comment was really terrific and very moving, and he should write a book about it. And I'll give it a decent review.
After you read your review of the last book.
You're going to review that one too?
Yeah. The second part was a bunch of baloney. I don't see anyone suffering among American Jews for taking all sorts of views on all kinds of Israeli questions. On the contrary, I see them doing quite well and having columns in reputable newspapers and important magazines. And this whole idea of suppression of dissent may sound, sort of slightly heroic, but I don't see where that suppression is taking place. I don't see Malcolm Hoenlein saying Peter Beinart will not be allowed to appear at the JCC in Palo Alto, one of the most influential Jewish communities in America.
Should we talk about the JCCs I've been disinvited from?
Well, I mean, look, you are a prominent person in the Jewish community, and there's no question about it, and the fact that so many people have come here to listen to you is a testimony to it. So I think this business of censorship is a little overwrought. But I do congratulate you on your beautiful and moving non-answer to. Now look, on the whole, for most of my life, I've been comparatively happy that most Jews vote Democratic, even though I haven't voted Democratic since 1992, but that's another story. And why is that? Because I've always felt that Jews provide, if you will, an anchor for a Democratic Party that has a tendency within it to become a replica of the socialist or social democratic parties or green parties of Europe, which are increasingly not only vehemently anti-Israel, but shading into something worse than that. And so if 70% of Jews vote the Democratic ticket, are inordinately influential on account of financing issues or whatever. And if that means that Democratic candidates feel a need to support Israel, at least at some kind of baseline level, that's a good thing. And by the way, I get back to this point, it's a free country. And the point you made about Jewish Americans is the right one. A Jewish American is not obliged only to think about Israel. Also, there's a lot to dislike about the Republican Party, even a Republican Party that is offering such full-throated support for the state of Israel. For one thing, sometimes that support seems insincere, or at least tinted with kind of a religious messianism, which doesn't sit well with me, and I'm sure with most people in this room. There are a lot of Republicans on the stage at these various debates that I couldn't vote for in a million years. I mean, and I say that as an editorial board member of the Wall Street Journal. So I feel like many of you must feel, I mean, looking at Donald Trump, you know, he may be pro-Israel, he may have Jewish grandchildren. You go, oh my God. That being said, I think there is a strain within the Democratic Party which is more than simply very critical of Israel. More than simply sort of within the framework of supporting Israel, but, you know, with dissenting, you know, this or that. There is a Stephen Walt, John Mearsheimer kind of cohort in there. And you saw that in some of the president's very early attempted appointments, some of which fortunately failed. I think the most important role that Jews can play, especially Jewish Democrats, is to say, let's remember why we support this country. And let's remember that Israel, the story of Israel isn't the story of just the occupation or this or that we don't like, but actually the 85% of Israel that we really like. We really like the fact that if you're gay, the only country in the Middle East you want to live in is Israel. If you're a woman, the only country in which you can have decent aspirations is Israel. If you're an environmentalist, the only country that gives a damn about the environment is Israel. If you believe in a rule of law, the only country that sends its prime ministers and presidents to jail is Israel. Those are liberal values. And by the way, I might add, those are my values.
It's become a specialty of ours to send those.
My values too. I think it's important, you know, look, I'm all for disagreeing. I make money, you know, I make a living off of disagreeing with Peter, you know.
I've noticed that.
It's not that I only do it for the money, Peter.
Why is it that our disagreements benefit you more financially than me?
But let's, you know, this is not my line. I think it's Alan Dershowitz or someone, but, you know, he talks about the 80% consensus. I think it's also important as we disagree, as we air differences, as Ruth very, I think, elegantly put it, we're a family that likes to argue, and that makes us smarter and stronger. Do remember the 80 or whatever percent it is, on which there is this powerful consensus that something miraculous has taken place in the Middle East, in Jewish history, and it behooves us always to bear that in mind and not get our sort of grievances and our neuralgic distempers, not allow those to get the better of us when we have these sorts of arguments. I mean, I know they get the better of me sometimes, and, you know, when I tone down, I regret it.
Peter, I just want to give you a short rebuttal of the point that there is there's a free expression for no matter what you
I think that Bret is right, that liberal Zionists, people like myself or, you know, Jeff Goldberg or others who have criticisms of Israel.
Jeff is liberal?
Jeff is not as liberal as me, but he's pretty liberal. That you can go in as a liberal Zionist American Jew to a lot of places in the Jewish community and speak. Here's what you can't do. It's very, very, very difficult to go as a Palestinian into a Hillel or a Jewish school or a synagogue. The vast, vast majority of synagogues, Jewish schools, and Hillels have never had a Palestinian inside, and that's because they define the parameters of acceptable discourse at Zionism. You have to be a Zionist. Well, you know, here's a little dirty little secret. Most Palestinians are not Zionists, and so they fall outside of the legitimate spectrum. And the reason I think that's a problem, right? It says in the Mishnah, it says, "Who is wise? He who learns from everyone." The American Jewish community is far, far too illiterate about Palestinian opinions. They never have Palestinians come and speak. And as a result, even from the most tribal of self-interest, when Ramaz, which is the fanciest Orthodox Jewish school in the city, disinvited Rashid Khalidi, the well-known Palestinian historian, after the kids themselves had invited him and tried to get him to speak, that keeps those kids ignorant. They need to know what Rashid Khalidi says, not so they can necessarily agree with him, but because they're going to hear it sooner or later on college campus, and they should be thinking about it. They should be, first of all, they may gain some empathy for Palestinians, for having met Palestinians, but also they need to understand what Palestinians are saying. Not some Jewish interpretation of what Palestinians are saying, but hear it from Palestinians. That's what doesn't happen.
I want to, you were optimistic. I want to challenge that.
It is Haaretz, after all.
In the sense that it seems to me that there was a recent release of another Pew Research survey about American Jews, which found that they continue to be by far the most liberal religious group in America. On almost any issue that you can think of, immigration and abortions, and I don't think that my impression is that is not the direction that Israeli society is going. Israeli society is growing less tolerant of freedom of expression, is growing less open to outside criticism, and I know that there are pockets where people are more pluralistic and more But the overall impression is, especially if you read Haaretz, that this is not the direction of the general population. So is it true that American Jews it's like two ships passing in the night, one is going one way and the other is going?
I would not choose this metaphor.
No,
I think politically and demographically, like it was said before, I think Aluf Ben pointed out that in first grade now, there are more and more ultra-Orthodox and Arab children and less of the kind of people that could be Israeli Democrats, being born and being raised. But still I see, and I want to talk about a movement within Israel, a cultural movement that I'm a part of Jewish Renaissance or Jewish pluralism that is growing all the time. And in some ways it is touching on and is part of what you mentioned, the minyanim, how did you call them? Independent or post-denominational minyanim.
Excuse me for interrupting you. They represent a small part of Israeli elites. They don't represent the general trend of public opinion.
That's again the question of how do we frame the conversation. When Brenner and Gordon, Echad Ha'am and Bialik, they were the leaders of Israeli culture, or the first kibbutz in Bitanya Elite that were like 25 kids. It's always a minority that can lead an intellectual new way. I don't think that that leadership could be the masses, but I think there is a new language within young Israelis that does not accept anymore the separation between religious and secular. It's like black and white. It's boring. It has a lot of the way we were brought up. In many ways, I echo what you say in America. In Israel, we were brought up ignorant in many ways in our own culture. We were raised as Israelis as opposed to being raised as Jews. And when you don't know your culture, your possibilities are very narrow. So I am a great believer in Jewish education within the non-denominational, non-halachic world, which is my community. And I see that when people study, and they reclaim classic Jewish text, they have the power to have a serious dispute. They have the guts or the courage to be in dispute and not to be so afraid of any other voice. And as I always say, Judaism is too precious to leave it only to Orthodox. Israel is too precious to leave it only to Israelis. We need the voices of all the Jews in the world.
Gidi.
Well, first of all, I think that when you look at the idea of Israel, the core idea of Zionism is that Zionism came to serve the entire Jewish people, to establish the nation state of the Jewish people. But I think that it's very important to remember context. And the context is that the Jewish people is probably the most resilient society in history. I mean, this is a way too big a room to do this exercise, but usually when I speak to smaller groups, I always ask the same question, which is, if there is one day where there is no more United States, Bret spoke about retreat, it disintegrates for some reason or another, like most empires did in the past and so on, would there still be Jews to watch that event on TV, if there is still TV? What do you think?
And commercials.
The answer is, in most rooms, the answer is yes. Close to 100% of the people in the room believe that the Jewish people is more resilient than the greatest power of our time. So inherently, there's tremendous resilience in our society. The second thing is, very important to remember, is that it was never better to be Jewish. Never, ever in our history was it better to be Jewish. Whenever I say that, someone always says, well, there was the days of Solomon. Yes, there were the days of Solomon, and maybe at the foot of Mount Sinai and so on. But for the last 2,000 years, never better to be Jewish. So what we're looking at is that we're at the peak of our power, influence, and prosperity, both in Israel and outside of Israel, and we're part of the most resilient society in history. So where is the challenge, I believe? The challenge is in Israel, because Israel is a new experiment. And if the secret of success, one of the secrets of success of diaspora is that it's a flat, decentralized, sorry for the big words, network of communities. No one's in charge, multiple centers of leadership, always competing, and that's a super resilient way of organizing people. Israel is vertical, and there is a government. So that interaction between the vertical and the horizontal is very problematic and very challenging. So a lot of the things that will affect these relationships actually come from Israel, and they come from this vertical element called government. And that's where we need to focus our conversations and our discourse. And there are some key issues where we in Israel got away with because we were in a condition of powerlessness, because we were existentially threatened, because we undertook this monumental project of immigration absorption and so on, that we will not be allowed to get away with in the coming decades. It's the way we treat the progressive communities in Israel. It's very, very difficult for Israel to come to progressive communities in America and say, hey, support us financially and politically, but your rabbis, that's not going to work in our little neck of the woods over there. The second piece is the way we treat our minority. That was mentioned earlier. The way we treat the condition of the Palestinians. That's also going to be a very significant issue moving forward, I believe. There's also the quality of the government that is affecting these relationships. So there's a bunch of issues that are in Israel that are treated in come from the government through issues of policy and regulations and so on that will affect the relationship. But other than that, when we look at the Jewish people as a whole, the Jewish people will continuously evolve to respond to Israel. And part of the challenges, I think, of many Israelis is that they treat the Jewish world as if someone's in charge. But the true attitude of diaspora Jewry to Israel is shaped community by community, synagogue by synagogue, rabbi by rabbi. And that's why Israel will have to be in a position where it can mobilize and inspire diaspora Jews. And in this respect, yes, it will be very important that we take a leading position in serving the needs of humanity, making a significant and distinctly Jewish and Israeli contribution to humanity will be critical, as long as the other issues. So this is what actually shapes the relationship. Because at the end of the day, if diaspora Jews was this powerful uncle and we were the poor, weak nephew, today, the nephew has grown stronger. They've built a startup. They made, they're doing well. Some of them are here. And that relationship is changing. And I think Zionism will evolve to respond to that as well.
Charlotte, are we taking questions from the audience? But are we taking?
7.
Are we taking questions from the audience? Anybody have a question?
There are many questions on
Over there.
Should I answer that?
All right, go for it.
Well, look, in a sense, they have. If you read closely the text, Khamenei wrote a letter of, quote, conditional support, which amounts to a wholesale renegotiation of the agreement. I mean, for one thing, he's insisting that sanctions not be suspended, they be lifted. And if his demand is met, it means that there's no such thing as snapback sanctions because there's no mechanism for the automatic reimposition. And so that in effect is happening already. The real question is how long do we go along with this until we notice that Iran is not keeping up its end of the bargain and it's not honoring some of the core terms. We'll find out. I mean, this is my favorite quote. The prediction is very difficult, especially about the future, which is not Yogi Berra, it's Niels Bohr. And it's a potent joke because there's the counter joke that under socialism, the past can never be predicted. So we'll find out.
There was a question on the screen. Can we see it? From Chaya Ruby. Can you read it? I'll read it. Interesting point, re-education. Peter, Ruth, haven't Israeli secular Jews also failed to educate their children in Jewish history, values, hence the rise of ultra-Orthodoxy, a religious vacuum?
I'd like to try and answer and also add something to that. I think there's something that I was also kind of intrigued with that was said before we came on stage about the fact that Israel is stuck in the Middle East. And I want to say that we are not stuck in the Middle East. We chose to come back to Israel. We are an Eastern religion. We are not a Western religion. And the way American Jews look at themselves here, that we are part of the Western world, is very nice. It's very easy for me to, to take part in that. But the more I study Talmud and Bible, Mishnah and so on, the more I understand that I am part of the East, and I understand Islam. And I think the way we look at ISIS as a problem that you have to manage, not just ISIS, Islam as a whole, as a thing that is not going anywhere and a problem that we have to manage. And there's not even a beginning of trying to study, to learn, to understand what are they saying, what in what they're saying touches some of the things that our ancestors said. And maybe there could be a way through knowing ourselves better to find a way to live next to them. I mean, they are the neighborhood. And I hope that I will go on living in the Middle East and in Israel, and that my children will be able to live there, and my hopefully one day grandchildren. And the way I am a believer in peace, not just management of a conflict. And I believe that begins with knowing who we are, knowing that the binding of Isaac is similar to the sacrifice of Ishmael, knowing that what happened to Rabbi Akiva happened to Bilal ibn Rabah, the first Muazzin, knowing that sulcha and slicha is the same word, and so on. Knowing ourselves, and I think in that sense, Israelis have something to give to American Jewry. And if I may say so, although I know it's not like the thing to say now, but Hebrew is a very big deal in understanding who we are, in having the key to our great books, and I believe in having answers to the questions that are most important to us and to our future today. So Sunday school, the way Sunday school was built in this country, and I had children in it, is not the way to learn the Hebrew that could be useful to write your columns and to manage the problems that we have to solve. It's not the Hebrew of only synagogue going. It's the Hebrew of life, of peace and war. And so I do think to the question that it's about education and that we sinned in some way because of good reasons, and that we have to repent. And Jews believe in slicha, you can start again. And I think it's already maybe 2 generations that we are educating ourselves, although there's always the far right of ultra-Orthodoxy and the far left that thinks that anything that happened before 48 is something that they don't need to learn. But I don't believe in ignorance. Ignorance is always weakness.
Just to pick up on that, I think one of the underappreciated factors that makes American Jewry in Israel so different is that we are in the United States an overwhelmingly Ashkenazi community. we have a very, very, very small Mizrahi presence in the United States, right? American Jews are overwhelmingly Chiloni Ashkenazim, right? So if you were to just take out that cohort of Israel, Israeli politics would look different. And if you were to look at the Mizrahi communities in the United States, right, the Syrians in Brooklyn and New Jersey, or the Persians in Los Angeles and Long Island, they would actually look a lot more similar, right, to the political style and political perspective in Israel. They're far to the right of the center of where kind of secular Ashkenazi most American Jews are. So I think that's one of the big problems that we have. I say this is that someone whose mother also happens to be Sephardi. It's one of the problems we have in understanding Israel is that without even thinking about it as American Jews, we equate being Ashkenazi with being Jewish. And so we have a lot to learn from a Sephardi, a Mizrahi kind of culture and history that we generally don't understand very well. But I would also say that I don't think that the Mizrahim in Israel are doing as great a job in being a bridge between Israel and the Muslim Middle East as they could be. To put it right, because I think many of them, frankly, like some of my own family, had to renounce their own Arabness in order to be accepted in Ashkenazi-dominated Israel in the 1950s. And that seems to me a tragedy because it's something that we could learn from you about.
I just want to I want to add another blind spot in the field of education, which is I feel in Israel, we are not being educated about the broader Jewish context of Zionism. So a friend of mine wrote an amazing book called My Promised Land, Ari Shavit. And if you look at his book, the book begins with his grandfather arriving in Israel in the late 19th century. That's the beginning of the book. And in my view, the beginning of Zionism is deep in the past. And it's coming out of the most amazing society that has been evolving over 2,000 years, and some of the core secrets of the success of Zionism, primarily the flexibility and the adaptability of our national movement, which is the most successful national movement of the 20th century, comes from the adaptability of Judaism. And you know, if Mark Twain asked what is the secret of Jewish immortality, the beginning of the answer is with Darwin, which is its adaptability. It's not a strength, it's not wisdom, it's adaptability. So that whole mechanism that we inherited into Zionism, that is the success of Israel, is totally absent from the Israeli educational system, and therefore a lot of people who are being groomed as Zionist leaders don't have this context to make their leadership interventions that I believe are necessary in the 21st century.
The final word.
I take what you're saying, and I think it's quite beautiful. I think it's also risky. The Jewish population in the world is roughly identical to what it was 100 years ago. That's a sign of a colossal failure. You know, people say, well, there'll be a Jew to witness the collapse of the United States. And as we'd like to say in Mexico, where I grew up, y con eso, you know, and with that, you know, Jews have made immense mistakes, historical mistakes in their past. I mean, read that wonderful book, The Pity of It All. Look at the course of German history. The last great golden age of Jewish civilization was probably in Germany 100 years ago, or maybe Austria. We should be wary of that. We should be mindful of that, of those lessons. I mean, we have Israel, and you know, it's important for Israel to be a beacon. It's important for it to be a bridge. But the real purpose of Israel is very simple. It's a survival mechanism for a people that has come perilously close to perishing one too many times. And that ought to be the baseline with which we think, the way in which we fundamentally think of Israel. At the end of the day, it's where half my family went to after the Holocaust in 1945. My side of the family came to the United States. It's where the Sephardic Jews from Iran, from Morocco, Libya, and so on, all had to flee, and they have something to tell us, by the way, by virtue of the fact they had to flee. The Russian Jews also. So it would behoove us to be modest in a sense, but very realistic about what the purpose of this state is, and what our core ambitions ought to be for it. And that begins with the survival of the Jewish people. Physical survival of the Jewish people, not, you know, to be a, you know, tikkun olam, light unto the nations. All that is extra, okay? It's extra, it's nice. But Israel exists so that Jews can sit there with an IDF that's going to defend them, no matter what.
If that's
Something,
true, we have to
something
take
something they never had before. And sorry.
If that is true, we have to take shifts in protecting it.
I agree. I
not
agree.
there
But
to
let's
protect
just
them.
remember what Israel is for.
But
It is to save us.
democracy is also essential to Israel's survival.
I'm all for democracy, 100% for democracy. It thrives. But you have to remember that when we talk about all of our ideals and our aspirations, when we talk about our dreams, it's more important that when we think about Israel, think this is a mechanism that keeps our deepest nightmares at bay.
So I just want to say, first of all, it's a fundamental point you're making, but there was another phenomenal book that was written recently by a guy by the name of Dr. Micha Goodman. And he wrote a book called The Last Speech, Na'um Ha'achron Shel Moshe, Moses' Last Speech. And it's about the message that Moses gives to the Jewish people just before he parts. And basically the message is that if we will not build an ethical society, we will not be able to sustain sovereignty. This is Moses speaking 35 centuries ago. And writes Micha Goodman that basically Zionism is our second chance. And therefore, the message of Moses is that you cannot disconnect sovereignty and power and ownership and control from the morality of society. And this is an historical message that is very important for us to carry forward. I'm sure we're not in disagreement, right? The basic foundation is obviously sovereignty, power, and control. But then what do we do with this sovereignty is the question we're all asking. And in the context of the relationship between diaspora Jews and Israelis, that relationship will be affected a lot with what we do with our sovereignty.
Look, one final thing. I know we have to go.
I want to respond to you also.
But just one
This is
small
like
thing.
a last-minute intifada. What's going on?
The one thing, what I thought we were going to find, what Peter and I thought Peter and I were going to be fighting about this the whole time through.
Yeah, you were very docile.
My basic complaint about a portion of American Jewry is for them, Israel is a kind of moral vanity. Israel is great if they can feel good about it, if they don't have to make arguments, if they don't have to get bogged down in complex questions. That's not the purpose of the state of Israel. It's not to make American Jews feel good about themselves. And I'm done.
I'd like to.
No, wait. Ruth.
I'd like to. I'm not sure this thing is working. It was. I'd like to say to you, I appreciate what you say, but I would not like to think of my life as a bunker that is waiting for, if something terrible will happen, you'll come. I'm thinking of, although my mother fled Germany, and she did come to Israel because she could not stay in Germany, and my father from Bulgaria, but I think of my own Judaism in the Bialik and Echad Ha'am terms of building culture in a place where you are the majority, and you have sovereignty, and you can decide what a holiday or Shabbat or your life will look like in the public space, and not only in nice rooms and synagogues. And that's a very big part of my Jewish standard of living that I feel is very high. And that is why I'm in Israel. And I would like to, some other time, start a conversation about that.
We just say,
This is the final word of the final word.
when Israel's founders, in the shadow of the Holocaust, amidst a war for their very survival, fielding an army significantly composed of people with numbers tattooed on their arms, when they wrote a Declaration of Independence that promised complete equality of social and political rights, irrespective of race, religion, and sex, that was not moral vanity. That was not written on Zaybars on the Upper West Side. They understood, they were prophetic, they understood that democracies were safer, that democracies would endure. They saw a future that many others did not see, which was that authoritarian societies that looked strong were actually weak. And that is, for me, the great, great danger of holding millions and millions of Palestinians under military law, without citizenship, without the right to vote, without free movement, because it corrupts Israeli democracy, and Israeli democracy is as important to Israel's long-term survival as the IDF. Because if you prove the anti-Zionists right, who are saying that Zionism and democracy are incompatible, if you prove them right by making permanent Israeli control over millions of people who lack basic rights, you are imperiling Israel's survival.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to our panel. That was riveting.